Welcome to Truly Terrified, Paranormal versus Physics, where we talk about some really weird stuff and Joe, the scientist, explains how it's not possible, or maybe it is. I'm Lynn and...
I'm Joe.
When I was in my 20s, I stumbled across a book at our local library that was all about the advancements in human reproduction, and it had a chapter on Parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis is a natural form of asexual reproduction in which embryos develop in the absence of fertilization. Most commonly, it's found in plants and invertebrate organisms. An increasing number of vertebrate species have recently been reported employing this reproductive strategy. But in this book, it claimed that a study had been done at the London University Hospital that did DNA tests on many women and their babies there and found that about 1% of the pairs were actually genetically identical, with the idea being that the pregnancies had resulted from spontaneous and asexual fertilization of the mother's egg.
What was the rate?
1%
Of everyone in that?
of the pairs, the mother-baby pairs.
Wow, that's crazy. I mean, 1% is not incredibly rare.
Now,
That's 1 in 100.
I did not have access to the internet at that time because in my 20s, of course, there was no internet, and at least not internet as we know it now. And so I wasn't able to look that up. But as time went on, I went back and tried to find the book, and I couldn't even find the book. I couldn't remember the name of it. And eventually, when internet was available, I tried looking this up and could find nothing that even came remotely close to saying that, first of all, that the London University Hospital had performed DNA tests on mother-baby pairs, or that they found that 1% of the pairs were genetically identical.
That's pretty high.
Yeah.
I wonder what the actual rate, though, is.
Well, I let me tell you. Anything that's born parthenogenetically is going to be female because it is going to get 2 X chromosomes passed down to the mother because there's no father contribution, so there's no Y chromosome contribution. Animals such as bees, wasps, ants, so forth have no sex chromosomes and reproduce by parthenogenesis. A few plants, reptiles, and fish are also capable of reproducing in this way. A few organisms such as crayfish, snakes, Komodo dragons, and sharks can produce sexually as well as by parthenogenesis. But there is nothing, no evidence that any mammal reproduces parthenogenically. None.
Do you mean it can't happen, or...
Supposedly, the science says it cannot happen. A significant milestone in reproductive science was achieved when Dr. Kono and his colleagues managed to create a parthenogenic baby mouse. And
so they cloned the mouse they cloned the mouse.
No, they didn't clone it. Cloning is something different. They started an egg growing without any other material, and that baby mouse was fostered and survived to reproduce successfully by conventional means. So cloning is something different. I learned a lot today.
Like procedurally different, like how they go about it is different, or
no, it is actually,
because it would be a clone, like the baby mouse that's born is a clone.
Procedurally, it's different. How they go about it in the lab is different.
Yeah.
Okay, so mature eggs and sperm normally only have half the genetic material of a typical body cell. To prevent an embryo from having a double set of genes following conception, eggs half their genetic complement relatively late in their maturation cycle. If they're activated before that stage, they will still retain a full set of genes. So going by that, the trick is to activate the egg, and then it would start growing.
So they like inject some proteins or something, and then it just starts that cycle.
It says genomic imprinting, the differential expression of genes depending on their parental origin, is the main and perhaps the only barrier to parthenogenetic development in mammals. But as far as I can tell, I don't see a barrier to mammals and parthenogenesis.
Cool.
But scientists say there is a barrier.
Okay.
So we're going to go on to cloning.
Okay.
So that's parthenogenesis, which would seem to be...
So parthenogenesis, from a more cultural standpoint, is like Jesus. It's a big example of immaculate conception. And that is the implication, right? It's conception without a father.
Contribution of male
that's the
genetic
for
material.
Most people, that's the significant part.
Yes.
Is
however
immaculate conception.
they would all be female. Now, I did see
that
something
makes Jesus especially interesting.
I did see something that said that there could be male offspring, but because they have no X or no Y chromosomes, they're sterile. Wait a minute. How could they even be male? If they have no Y chromosome, they're not male. So do they mean that
I honestly don't know enough about the biology,
genetics and stuff
of Genesis like that. But I think, again, the significant part is the effect, the perceived effect of it, which is, here's a lady, and now she's pregnant, and her baby is a clone of her.
Okay,
or not even a clone. I mean, it doesn't take that. It's like there was no man involved. It was like she's stuck on an island. Now there's a baby. You know, that's the interest. That's the part that most people would think about, right?
Right.
So, like, from what you read, it's not really possible in mammals. Although I think I've heard stories in the past where it was proposed. Though, considering people are less than honest even with themselves about like, for instance, people frequently will be pregnant, they won't even know it.
Right.
The lack of introspection or whatever most people have.
Or they're in denial. Or
they choose not to believe it or whatever. And they make up this story. And then if other people believe it, it escalates from there. So, like, oh, this lady, she says there's no father, but she's pregnant.
Yeah. So then, before DNA, people might actually bought that crap.
Yeah. And, well, is it possible? So theoretically, if a baby was born, could you test for it and determine?
Yes. You could do genetic testing.
It would be a clone of the mother. So it would have the exact DNA?
Yes. The exact same DNA. Okay. So this does go hand in hand with cloning because, as you pointed out, if parthenogenesis has occurred, the offspring is a clone of the parent. So that book from the library, it also further claimed that there were very wealthy people at that time in the world. So when I was in my 20s, that would have been the 80s, who had the funds to have clones of themselves conceived artificially and were doing it right then in the 1980s.
This is somebody's ideas of what's happened, like a conspiracy theory.
That book said that. And whatever was in the rest of the book, it seemed really legit. It was about modern reproduction, and it was.
But there was no because I've never heard that before. In fact, I think the first human clone was much more modern than that.
Okay, well, I found out some interesting things. So I think there probably were people at that time that were attempting it. Whether they were succeeding or not, I don't know.
That is one thing. If at any point people developed a technology, they may have used it in who knows what ways. And it could have also been lost again. A big idea in conspiracy theory circles is that at one point there were civilizations with a high technology level, or barring that, a technology was developed and then lost.
Right.
Like, for instance, there are some people who believe that nuclear weapons were developed sometime long ago and then lost. Now, it is probably the case that if there was a race of dinosaurs 100 million years ago or whatever that developed high technology and then they were destroyed, there would be little to show that ever happened.
Right.
Even radiation spikes. You couldn't maybe even potentially rule out natural sources, like time decays all. When the technology of gene manipulation was in its infancy, or
IVF,
when that was in its infancy, there could have been somebody who knew about it, had access to somebody who could do it, and then they did it. Or the researchers themselves. Like in China, it's been proposed that probably there are Chinese children who have had their genes manipulated and they're actively still doing it, but they wouldn't tell anybody.
Right.
So the researchers have access to the technology and they're using it, but no one else knows.
Okay, so I've got some stories for you.
Okay.
But just to be clear, although identical twins are genetically identical, they aren't considered clones by ethicists. So,
ethicists?
yes, this is...
So people who study ethics?
Yes, because this is all being controlled and advised by ethicists. All of this. Parthenogenesis, cloning.
Is that... So I really think a distinction has to be made from like a pragmatic standpoint, from like a philosophical standpoint. Is that ethicists who are controlling the public image of what's happening?
Yeah, they're controlling the narrative.
So they're controlling what the public is told so that they don't overreact.
Right. Okay, so
not from a philosophical standpoint where it's like,
no,
these are not clones.
It's more of a political standpoint.
Okay.
The cloning of humans supposedly has not been documented. Supposedly.
Up to now?
Yeah. Supposedly scientists have...
there was a case where, at least one case where there was a cloned human.
Supposedly, scientists have only recently begun cloning mammals. And yet, we'll find that that's not true. So, on December 27th, 2002, Brigitte Bosselier, I don't know, it looks like a French name, held a press conference in Florida, and she announced the birth of the first human clone called Eve. But there's no proof
according to her.
But there's no proof that Eve exists.
Yeah, any evidence?
No. They've never produced her. There's no evidence that Eve exists.
Yeah. Claims are cheap.
Yes. Cloning is asexual reproduction in which all offspring have an identical nuclear genome to that of the parent. So they're genetically identical to the parent. And it doesn't have to be a female parent. So it could be any cell in the body can be used to produce a clone. In parthenogenesis, they use an egg. So this is the...
Because it has to be the egg that starts... They're just causing it to start developing.
Right. Yeah. So they have to catch it at the exact moment when it still has all of the pairs of DNA that it needs to have.
Makes sense.
Chromosomes that it needs to have. Okay, so... in recent years, mammalian cloning has been achieved by the introduction of somatic cell nuclei into fertilized eggs from which the nucleus has been removed. So essentially what they've done up in later years is kind of like parthenogenesis, except that it's artificially obtained. So they take a cell, they remove the nucleus, and they use that to fertilize the egg. Or do they take a fertilized egg? I'm not really sure.
I don't know that it matters that much.
In somatic cell nuclear transfer, or SCNT, the nucleus of a somatic cell is taken from a donor and transplanted into the host egg cell, which has had its own genetic material removed previously. Oh, so they take the egg and they take out the nucleus and then they put another cell in, and then after the donor somatic cell genetic material is transferred into the host egg, the material is fused with the egg using an electric current. Once the two cells have fused, then they let the cell grow in a surrogate or artificially. And that's the process they used to successfully clone Dolly the sheep.
Oh, yes. I remember that.
Dolly the sheep was in, I think, 1996. Then, although they say that there is no successful human clone that has occurred, the first hybrid human clone using that same method was created in 1998 by a company called Advanced Cell Technology. A nucleus was taken from a man's leg cell. It was inserted into a cow's egg, where the nucleus had been removed from the cow's egg, and the hybrid cell was cultured and developed into an embryo.
A human?
And it grew.
Into a human.
They destroyed it after 12 days because it was growing a human using a cow's egg.
I mean, it makes sense.
It does.
The genetic material in the egg, the nucleus determines how it will, everything about it. That's all of the information of the organism.
So it wouldn't be a hybrid cow human. No. It would be a human that would grow.
It'd be like how they sometimes take, like, what is it, pig hearts? Yeah. Put them in humans. You're still a human. You're not like a pig.
But I think it was interesting that it grew for 12 days. It was still a zygote. The zygote is a solid ball of cells, then becomes a hollow ball of cells called a blastocyst. Once it implants in the uterus, it develops into an embryo. So it was not an embryo yet. Although they used the word embryo, it was not. It was a zygote. So when it's an embryo, it starts having a human form. But genetically, it was a human. It was absolutely a human zygote. One of the big arguments I saw online, and I saw it over and over, was that a clone wouldn't have a soul. Like, it requires sex to have a soul?
So this is why I'm a pragmatist. What is the effect of the soul? I mean, like in this context, so this person is a clone, they don't have a soul. This person is not a clone, they have a soul, right? Mm-hmm. Show me anything that fundamentally distinguishes them. That's the pragmatic effect, and that validates what you're saying. There is some difference, but there isn't a difference. No one has shown any difference.
And if there was, regardless of what the ethicists are saying, then that would mean that identical twins share a soul, which is absurd.
That'd be cool.
Well,
like
it
a
might be
single hive mind soul.
Well, okay. Susan Anderson from the University of Connecticut said this, and this was a really good remark. She said, quote, "It has been said that a cloned human being wouldn't have a soul, wouldn't be a unique individual, but clones..."
They have to validate this shit. I mean, it's like anything. Like they say, okay, it's this, a soul is this body made of material that doesn't interact with normal matter. I mean, anything. You can't just say soul because what is it? Okay. I mean, it's like every other word that corresponds with reality. You can break into a sentence or like a story that you then can use to reconstruct the word. You can use to describe someone when they don't know the word. So like soul, you can't break it apart. What does it mean?
Okay, so... okay.
They have to validate it.
I want to read this whole quote, and then I have a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. It has been said that a cloned human being wouldn't have a soul, wouldn't be a unique individual, but clones would not be any less full human beings than the originals. If we have souls, then so would they. They would be no less their own persons than identical twins are. Furthermore, they would probably be more unlike their originals than identical twins are dissimilar because they would develop at different times in different environments. My remark about this is that if the soul is a function of your physical being, then that slaps the argument about these religious people saying your soul is something ethereal from God. So that,
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But if it's something...
God could actually, at any point, inject a soul into anything.
Right. And if it's something spiritual, not of the physical body, then it doesn't matter if you're cloned or not. So the soul argument is BS. It's BS no matter which way you look at it. If it's a physical aspect, this person from the University of Connecticut just said they would not be as similar as identical twins are because they would develop at different times in different environments. Yeah. And we know epigenetics have a huge role. They would probably be grown in different uteri. Mm-hmm. You know, that it's just an absurd argument. So that argument, let's just toss that out the window because I don't think that's worth talking about. I have to say,
I mean, it could be. There is some validity there. But you have to be clear. It's like I couldn't go into court and use that as an argument because there'd be nothing to distinguish the case where you're right or you're wrong. It's like you go up to a god, a literal god. It fucking came down from heaven, just arrived out of a portal from another dimension or something. It is a god, confirmed, no doubt. It knows the truth. You and a different person are saying, which of us is right? I believe there's a soul. This person doesn't believe there's a soul. One of you are right, and there is a real truth as far as, you know, anything can have a real truth. So barring, like if the God says figure it out yourself, you have to go and find the evidence.
And you can't find evidence.
There's no evidence.
There's no evidence.
Well, some people believe there is evidence, but none of it's very convincing. If it was convincing, it would blast past the culture war differences that keep people on their sides, and scientists would say, "Yep, this is pretty convincing," because scientists in general are pretty not biased. In general, people really, again, you can't just make a claim. Again, claims are cheap.
The problem with seeking evidence for something like, do we have souls? What are our souls? Is that so many of these arguments are based on what a person feels. And it's the same with religion. They're basing their evidence that God exists or that the afterlife exists or that the afterlife doesn't exist or anything like that They're basing it on their feelings. Now, a thrill is an actual physical response to a thought process, or, it might be a shock or whatever. Religious people, and I think probably fanatics of any sort, when they get a thrill, that physical response, they believe that this is proof that this is something that's true. If you ever go into an LDS meeting, instead of having a preacher get up in other churches I've been in and give sort of like a lesson where they read from a scripture and then they apply it and they explain how this applies to you, the Mormon church has somebody from the audience get up and they give their testimony. And their testimony is merely them saying, I know that this is true. I know the Book of Mormon is true, or I know that Joseph Smith was telling the truth because, and then they give a very emotional story. And it's just like the Catholic Church burning incense and, all the other things, the stained glass light coming through and all of those things. It's all to elicit an emotional response in the people that are there being part of this ceremony.
Yeah.
And so when you have people saying there's a soul or there's not a soul, if they're basing it on their physical or emotional response, their feelings, it's irrelevant. It is absolutely irrelevant.
Yeah, well, okay, so if you have two things, like, for instance, like two pieces of evidence for different things, someone goes to church and they go up to the thing and they tell the story, and this is evidence for that there being a soul. If you can find anything that is an equivalent degree of evidence for a different explanation, then you've maybe provided evidence for that set of two things, but you have not actually proven anything.
Right.
So, like, if I then go to the Satanist church and it's somebody, they go up and they had a thrill and they said there is no soul. That's all it takes. And there are people having much stronger perceived experiences, like on drugs, that go way beyond what people experience in church, or religious people experience when they're praying or whatever. What those people say is just all over the place. In fact, people on certain drugs perceive what's called ego death. Ego death is essentially your soul not existing. You are just a part of the universe. It's just a universe or something. It's like you are taken completely out of the equation. So that's very powerful, much stronger experiences than people going to church and having their little rush of thing along their spine. That's a very, very common thing from people who experience that, is they say, I don't exist. So again, here are a class of experiences that say, yes, soul. Here are a class of experiences, but that are actually way more intense, that say no soul or no me at all. That neither of them are evident. Like you can't draw the line and say, no, this is better.
Examine them, you can't duplicate them,
Exactly.
You can't do anything. Okay, so I did think, and this kind of goes along with that, the drug thing of saying that they've death of self. When I did a search to see if there, I figured I was going to find stories of people who said, I believe I'm the result of Parthenogenesis, I look exactly like my mother, or I believe I am a clone. If that was happening in the when Dolly the sheep was
98.
done. Okay, so it was a long time ago. They're going to be 25 years old now. You would think that there are people who are 25 years old now who would say, I am the result of cloning, or I am the result of Parthenogenesis. I couldn't find a single one. And there are some really kooky people on the internet, and you can find just about anything you can imagine.
Well, I think a lot of when people say they are the special thing, is a meme. They learned that there's this thing people do where they say they're the special in some way, and then they do it. It's monkey see, monkey do. So like in this, it's like people who quote unquote get abducted by aliens. So they read a story and they say, this happened to me and I was abducted by aliens. Or people who spontaneously combust or whatever, somebody brings it up, and now people see this is a possibility, and then I think all it would take is popular story to be in the media of somebody claiming that. And then it's also like serial killers, copycat killers, super strange thing where people just replicate what
when you
other
said
people
that
have done.
About the drug addicts and feeling like they've lost their sense of self, what came to my mind is that when you're saying that you were created as a result of parthenogenesis, or you were cloned, that is kind of like saying, I'm not unique, I am not an individual. There's a perception that you're part of somebody else. You're not really your own self. And so maybe it's less popular to have that delusion because it's, that would not be giving you any special anything. You'd just be sucked into the genetics of somebody else, according to you. And
you could imagine a scenario where someone says, I'm the clone of...
or a famous person.
A famous person.
Yeah, that's true. There are apparently people who say that some very famous performers, and Avril Lavigne was one of them, have been replaced by clones.
Yeah. I think people underestimate the variability in people's appearances, voices, etc.
because
over the course of any time period.
Yeah.
Like even the lighting, the video quality, the the aperture of the camera, like it distorts people's appearances.
Right.
People can look vastly different, behave vastly different, be vastly different.
Yeah.
Even in a 5-minute time period.
And also, these performers, they have got the absolutely best makeup, lighting, airbrushing.
So you're seeing them very different.
Yeah.
And then they come back later and they look out of place. Come on.
Have you ever seen any of those videos where somebody puts on makeup and they transform from an ordinary looking person to absolutely look 100% like someone famous?
Yeah. Well, have you seen the ones where it's like somebody really attractive and then they like make a stupid face and they're just like, look absolutely
conversely,
horrible.
There are videos of somebody who looks grotesque. They have a weird expression on their face. Maybe their teeth are all jacked up or they don't have teeth. Their eyes are droopy and weird, and they just look really, and their hair's stringy and awful. And then they put on all this makeup and pop in their false teeth and they're absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, yeah.
So that is no argument for saying Avril Lavigne has been cloned, and that's why she still looks young. To recap, parthenogenesis, as far as I can tell, they can do it. They can artificially start the process, but they haven't actually let a parthenogenic animal. Well, no, they did, didn't they? That
sheep?
That mouse.
Oh, the mouse, yeah.
Kaguya or whatever its name was.
So, do you know if they've taken, like, for instance, a mouse and put it into a pig?
I don't know.
You know what I mean?
I don't know. But, okay, so parthenogenesis is an egg being stimulated to grow without genetic material from a male. That's what parthenogenesis is. Whether it's a natural stimulation, which does occur in certain animals, or an artificial one like they did with the little mouse, and the mouse grew up and had babies of her own. While cloning is an egg that's not going to grow, and it's the other material you add into the egg, because you've taken out the nucleus of the egg and you put something else in, so it's that other material that grows. In the one, it's the egg that grows, and in the other, it's the other material that grows, and the egg is just the catalyst for making it grow.
What's that called?
That's cloning.
So those are the names for the procedural differences. So like cloning procedure is them putting material into.
Yes, and parthenogenesis is stimulating an egg to grow. However, parthenogenesis does occur spontaneously in some animals, some plants, some invertebrates. Absolutely, it does occur. There is some discussion about whether or not it occurred in human beings, but I can find no evidence of it.
I think even if it had, there'd be so much culture war stuff attached to it. Like if certain people believe that cloned people don't have souls, then somebody was cloned and they know they were cloned.
Right.
They might not want to say they're cloned, or they might claim they're cloned, and people would not. They'd say no, that didn't actually happen.
Right.
Or,
and there are people who are super mega rich who could have cloned themselves. There are. This next part, we're going to go from cloning to chimeras.
Okay. Chimeras or chimeras?
I saw chimeras, but I'll look it up. Okay.
Chimera.
Chimera. Okay.
Chimera. Back in 1976, there was a lady named Lydia Fairchild. She was an American, and she had a kid and wanted to get child support. So she applied for child support, and they said, and the dad said, I'm not the dad. And so she had to do a DNA test. And she gave her DNA, and the dad gave his DNA, and the baby got their DNA taken. And they said, well, the man's the dad, but you're not the mother. So she was accused of fraud. I know, can you imagine? She was accused of fraud or a surrogacy scam or something like that. And so that she had other children too. And then they were in doubt whether the other children were hers. And she got pregnant again. And they were so convinced that she was up to some no good that they had somebody come in and stand there while she had her third baby or whatever birth that was.
What could possibly be the purpose of someone standing there?
To make sure that a baby came out of her, and then they tested that baby right there.
In a hospital?
And they said it wasn't her baby.
You know how fucking hard it would be to switch a baby out?
Well, they're saying it's a surrogacy scam. They're saying it's some surrogacy scam. But here's what they did. When they did a cheek swab, it didn't match with her baby. When they did a cervical swab, it did. She was a chimera. So in Greek mythology, a chimera actually means she-goat, and it was a monstrous fire-breathing hybrid creature composed of different animal parts. But the term chimera has come to describe any mythical or fictional creature with parts taken from various animals, or to describe anything that's composed of disparate parts or perceived as being wildly imaginative, implausible, or dazzling. But we're not talking about mythological creatures. These are real live chimeras, and they walk amongst us. It occurs when a woman is pregnant. Well, there's several different ways it occurs. One of them is when a woman is pregnant with twins and one embryo dies and the other embryo absorbs the twin cells, and that's called tetragametic because the baby was derived from 4 gametes, 1 egg and 1 sperm for each embryo. So
makes sense.
That makes sense. The experts say they're not sure how often or how common natural chimeras are in the human population, and they claim that only 100 cases have been documented so far. However, I found lots of cases just like that lady where it was something goofy like that.
Yeah.
And Daniel.
Yeah, Daniel had.
Yeah, so they did genetic testing on him, and they said he had different genetic coding in different parts of his body, so that he was actually a chimera. There's also microchimerism, which is probably what he had. So in humans, chimerism is most commonly occurs when a pregnant woman absorbs a few cells from her fetus.
Makes sense.
And I talked about this the other day, and then I think I took it out of our podcast because I said, I want to check into this.
Oh, okay.
The opposite may also happen when a fetus absorbs a few cells from its mother. Those cells can travel through the mother or fetus's bloodstream and migrate to different organs, and then they can stay there for your entire life. And so that's called microchimerism. Am I pronouncing that right? Microchimerism.
Sounds right.
It can also happen if you get a blood transfusion or a stem cell transplant or a bone marrow transplant. There are lots of cases like that. So the reason why I put this with the other 2 types of strange genetic situations, like parthenogenesis or cloning, is because you're not all one thing. In this case, it's almost like the opposite of cloning. It's like decloning you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That is a good way to put it, because in one you have less variation, and in the other you have more variation.
Yeah. So it can happen spontaneously. So there's the chimerism.
Oh my God.
That's hard. Okay. And then there's the kind where you were a twin and you absorbed your twin, and now you have this other genetic material in you. Oftentimes, what happens is a person will go to one of the fun DNA testing, and they will do their DNA, which is spit. So you're spitting into a tube, although there are some that require a swab where you swab your cheek and you get cheek cells. And so you do those tests, and then it'll say something like, you're the sister of your aunt. Well, you can't be the sister of your aunt, but you could be if it was your mother's cells.
Yeah.
So that's where those odd things come up. That probably is not as common as these other kinds. So some symptoms. And if you think about this, you'll think, oh my gosh, we've all seen this. This is why I think when they say that it doesn't happen that often, I think it happens way more often.
Yeah.
Way more often. Hyperpigmentation, like increased skin darkness, or hypopigmentation, where you've got patches of light skin, and it could be half your body.
Patches.
It could be a stripe. There have been people, when they have ultraviolet light put over them, they have checkerboard on them.
Yeah, interesting. And that is one color is one set of genes, the other is
right
another.
Because when the fetus is growing, the way the body stretches out,
patches,
right,
because of how they're absorbed. They're not absorbed like uniformly and mixed together.
Right.
They're like blobbed together.
Two different colored eyes.
Heterochromia.
Yeah.
So think about what that means. Imagine you have one color eye on one side, one color eye on the other side. You kind of like drew a line where the split was. Like if you took a sample from one side, it's like one genetic profile, and then the other side has a different genetic profile. That, like, you can picture two halves of two different people being slammed together, but they're one person. It's one person.
Right. It is one person. It is not two people.
It also reminds me of your brain has two hemispheres connected by some tissue in the center of your brain, and you can actually cut that. And people with certain like seizure epilepsy, it's bad enough. They used to, and they might still do it in severe cases. They cut it. So the seizure cannot spread from one side.
It's not electrical activity from one hemisphere to the other.
And that's why they do it. Each side of your brain can essentially function without the other side. It's not like necessary, and actually you could remove a hemispherectomy. You can remove half your brain, and
right.
Now your left eye goes to the right side of your brain, right hemisphere.
Yep.
It crosses over. So if you took out half your brain, the other half of your body would no longer function. And there may actually be like brain plasticity. Your brain can remap some of that back to the other side. But
okay, so since your eyeballs are actually part of your brain system, if your eyes are two different colors, does that mean that you have different genetics in different parts of your brain?
And it's not necessarily that like only one hemisphere has one set of genes. It could be like 90% of that hemisphere is genes A, the other, 10% is genes B. So it's like analogical, the hemisphere thing and the body thing. So you have half your genes A on the left, genes B on the right. Like your left eye is A, your right eye is B. Same thing with your hemispheres. Like if you cut you in half, you would presume the other half of A would be also A, but not necessarily. And yet together they function normally.
Right.
The really interesting thing though is what? So like you think about you have a perspective. It's not like discontinuous. It's not jumping. I mean, there's a little bit of jumping. Like when you turn your eyes, it's a little bit of a discontinuity. Like you might wake up, kind of take a second to get your bearings and, So it's like this. If I took one neuron out of your brain and put it in another brain, or not another brain, but it's like a pile that will become a brain, okay? Your perspective is not changed. Generally, it might be like a memory is disturbed or something, but you have not changed. Take 2 neurons out. Take 4, 8, until you're taking little chunks and your memories are disturbed maybe a little bit, but your perspective has not changed until the point where you're taking, at what point does your perspective then jump?
Well,
a completely different perspective.
Right. So what I was thinking about is, could the incidence of twin pregnancies, it is believed happens much more frequently than twins. And what happens is one of the fetuses
dies.
Yeah, usually when it's at embryo stage, dies and is just absorbed. And when you say just absorbed, you're not taking into consideration it's the other fetus that's absorbing it. And so if that is happening much more frequently than twins are born, that means that the incidence of chimerism would be more frequent than the incidence of twins.
Yeah, and twins themselves could have that effect as well.
They could. So here's the question. Could this explain certain people having mental illnesses? Or
yeah, so if one set of genes produces slightly different ratio of proteins, it produces protein X slightly more than the genetics B, then if you have a section of your brain that is acting differently because it's producing proteins differently or whatever, or your genes informed how that section should be structured and is structured like there's a discontinuity in the structure, then absolutely. However, the question would be then, is the effect of that more significant than the effects of normal development? You fall and hit your head as a kid, you have brain damage. Does the brain damage have more of an effect than, you know what I mean? So like in a sense, you are a chimera of all of your experiences as well. So I think there's like a difference in how to view this. One, you are like a pure being, and two, you're a being composed of like quadrillions of cells that are each essentially independent but interact to form a more complex unit.
Which may include siblings, your mother, your child.
Yeah, but it's really like, again, pragmatism comes to the rescue. What is the effect? What is the actual like perceived result of all of those differences? It's like if you didn't know this person had chimerism, then is there any like noticeable difference between them and just like for instance, half their brain is genes B and whatever. Is there any difference between like them and this other person and their one genetic?
Well, here's the problem. You would never be able to tell if somebody was a chimera unless you tested every single cell in their body, and you can't without blenderizing them.
And keep in mind, you're also a chimera of cells that have mutated.
Yes.
So like each cancerous cell is slightly different, and each cell is slightly different.
Yes.
So again, it's like the idea of like complex versus simple models. We try to have as simple models as possible because that reduces the amount of information our brains have to encode. It increases the breadth of information we can encode. So the idea here is that we can use a simple model to describe humans, that they're pure beings, that they have one set of genes. It's like the idea of a soul, a monad, a thing that is indivisible. That is the conception of a person. Whereas, on the other hand, the more complex model, which is more accurate, 100%, it is more accurate. It's harder to fit in your brain, but it is more accurate, is you are a collection of lots of different things. You're a physical process, assuming you believe materialism, whatever. And so it's like, how do you draw the line between a chimera and a regular person, quote unquote, is you can't. You know what I mean? There's no like, oh, because this person has whatever a percentage of cells, a different genetic profile. Really, this person is exactly the same as everyone else. It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter if they have cancer in their body that's different. They might have genes from when they were conceived and twins that are absorbed that are different. They're a patchwork of lots of different things, but you can still use the simple model. That's like 99.99% accurate. They're a person, and you can tack on things like, okay, they're mentally ill. Is there a causal model for why they're mentally ill? Maybe the causal model is they're a chimera. Does it even matter, though? You can't treat that.
Okay, so here's a practical reason why I think that we need to have a better system of understanding this. and it is, as more and more people go and order it up on the internet and get their DNA tests done, I think that they're going to discover issues like that where it comes up.
I could see that being an issue.
And it's a huge
depending
issue.
on how prevalent it is.
There's training for counselors now to counsel people who have had unexplained or unexpected DNA results. Mm-hmm. And how many of these are actually because of something like that? Where they think, oh, my mother wasn't really my mother. It was really her sister who was my mother, but she's dead, so I can't test her. So I just have to assume that.
It's like, even in, like, it's funny because this is the thing with, like, we're trying to apply a simple idea of what a person is to something that's more, I mean, reality is the ultimate in complexity. There's no way you can understand all of reality, not even all of your own body. So, like, the people who get upset because blah, 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 like, they get the genetic test and whatever. They have the simple idea that they are not the child of their parents, which may or may not be right, depending on if they have chimerism or whatever. Maybe there's a mix-up at the lab, it's like, but then does it even fucking matter? I mean, there's, like,
and that's, I think, the important thing is, does that really matter that much? And obviously it matters to people. We did DNA tests. Yeah. And I'm into genealogy.
DNA tests and it came out really strange, then
it'd be like a head scratcher and you'd want to figure it out. Okay.
Though day to day, it would not change anything.
No, it would not change anything. So I thought about this. I thought about this for a long time because of Daniel having been diagnosed as having chimerism. And so I have thought about it. Now, there are some health implications because autoimmune disorders seem to go along with this.
So that's the point when it really does matter.
Also, intersex people being born who aren't one sex or the other, because if it's in their sexual genetics, then they could be...
Though consider, so if you have the causal model of your disease, which is, let's say your junk is a completely different set of genes, what can you do?
Well,
in the future, potentially you could have one part of your body sent off to a factory. They'd produce an organ that then is put on your body, and then it matters where it's taken from.
Okay, so I just want to say that not only intersex physically, but intersex emotionally, where people feel like they're another gender. Mm-hmm. My takeaway from this is, instead of trying to fix, air quote, fix this discrepancy in your genetic makeup, probably we ought to say, oh, that's interesting. It's like you have one blue eye and one brown eye. Okay, that's interesting. Oh, you have the external genitalia of one sex, but you feel like you're the gender of another sex. That's interesting. Rather than being so fired up to believe that everything is cut and dried. It's not cut and dried.
That's the important thing. The first thing you should always do when you encounter some discrepancy in your understanding or whatever is recognize the extent of how you are treating the thing. That is your model of the thing. Like in this case, I believe I'm a whole person with one set of genes, whatever. That's your model. You should always then first drop down into a more complex model and look at the different possibilities. What could that more complex model be like? So you say, I'm a mass composed of lots of different cells working together to produce this complex organism. So there's nothing in that model that says I can't have half my body be a different set of genes.
Right. I would imagine that we all have a mix of genetics inside of us.
Well, 100%. If you have tumors in your body, they're slightly different. They're pragmatically different. They function differently, probably in a very negative way differently. I guess it's really important in the end for people to recognize that, one, it's always more complicated. It's always more complex. Reality is nothing like you think it is. for one. And for two, why in particular does any one thing matter? I'm a pragmatist. That means it matters if it produces a different result, essentially. So, like, if you're a chimera, if you live 50 or 60 years in the future or whatever, you lost your finger or something and you need a new finger built. It matters where they take the genes then from your body.
Yes.
Or it might not matter. I mean, it doesn't matter necessarily if they get genes A or genes B. But, and in the case of like mental health, right now, there's nothing, it doesn't matter if you know what's causing it.
Mm-hmm.
All you can do is essentially the equivalent of throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks.
You're supposed to throw spaghetti at the wall, not shit.
Yeah. With like drugs, like neurotransmitter uptake inhibitors, with talk therapy, and you can try some of the techniques like CBT, whatever. But it's not like you can go and excise the chimera cells, like you want only genes A, so you cut out genes B. You can't do that with your brain 100%. And if you tried, you wouldn't want the effects of that. So I guess in essence, my feeling is chimerism doesn't actually matter all that much, except in some small. It doesn't matter because one, that you are that anyway, and two, because there's nothing you can really do after the fact. After you already are a chimera, you are a person, and you are a complex bundle of cells and whatever. It's very complex. No one knows, where's your consciousness emerge? If you are part genetics A, part genetics B, the interaction there, and it's all very complex. And if you want to understand it, if you want a causal model for what's wrong with you or whatever, then you look at that more complex way of treating the human body and how you were born. Maybe you are a clone. You have the same genetics as your parent. It's a good idea to look at the more complex model, but generally you can drop back to I'm a person, and most of the you're a clone. You have no soul because you're a clone. You were created in a lab inside of a cow or whatever. You are a chimera. You're a person. That's the model that matters 99% of the time.
While Joe isn't convinced that anyone has a soul, I more firmly than ever think the soul is something disconnected from genetics or even the physical body. Have we changed your mind? Let us know. Our contact information is in the show notes, and as always, if you have a story you want to tell, send it to us. Please share, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and never be so terrified you can't run.